I will be brief because I'm looking forward to hearing a bunch of other voices, both athletes and non-athletes. The Trump presidency, as all of you know, I think, has brought American democracy to the breaking point. Trump has encouraged violence. He's deployed government institutions as weapons against his opponents, and he's undermined the integrity of elections through false claims of fraud, attacks on mail-in voting, and basic unwillingness to accept defeat. He's been aided and abetted throughout the last 4 years by a Republican Party that has fallen dangerously into the grips of white nationalism. The Republican Party's white Christian base, facing the loss of not only its electoral majority, but its dominant status in our society, has radicalized, pushing the Republican Party to engage increasingly in voter suppression, to subvert democratic norms and practices, and crucially, to tolerate the president's lawless behavior. As a result, Americans now face the prospect of something that would have been unthinkable even 5 years ago. We go into the November election unsure whether we'll be able to cast a ballot fairly, whether our ballots will be counted, whether the candidate favored by voters will win, and whether the results will trigger post-election violence. So Democratic backsliding is no longer a matter of concerned speculation, as it was when Daniel Ziblatt and I first wrote How Democracies Die. It is a real thing. Global democracy indices like Freedom House, Varieties of Democracy, all show an erosion of American democracy since 2016. According to Freedom House, which is a center-right institution, the United States is now less democratic than Chile, than the Czech Republic, Slovenia, Taiwan, and Uruguay. So the damage is real. But I want to suggest that America may also be on the brink of a democratic breakthrough. The Trump presidency has helped to crystallize a new multiracial democratic majority that I think has the potential, at least, to lay a foundation for a more democratic future. Public opinion has shifted in important ways in the last 4 years. According to a poll by political scientist Michael Tesler, the percentage of white Americans who agree, and I quote, there is a lot of discrimination against African Americans, increased from 19% in 2017, which is a shockingly low number, to 50% in 2020. Likewise, a Pew survey found that the percentage of Americans who believe that the country needs to, and I quote, continue making changes to give blacks equal rights with whites rose from 46% in 2014 to 61% today. Americans increasingly embrace ethnic diversity. Another Pew poll, the percentage of Americans who believe that newcomers strengthen American society increased from 46% in 2016 to 60% today. This emerging multi-ethnic democratic majority was visible, I think, most strikingly in the aftermath of the police killing of George Floyd. As all of you know, the killing triggered the biggest wave of protest in American history. At least 15 million, maybe as many as 25 million Americans took to the streets. 3/4 of Americans supported the protest. And for the first time, large majorities, including 60% of whites, embraced the Black Lives Matter movement. That number has declined a bit, but it's still majority support. This is why Trump's sort of neo-Nixonian effort to appeal to America's silent majority has completely failed. Majority sympathies lay with the protesters, seeking not a heavy-handed return to America's racially exclusionary past, but rather steps toward its multiracial democratic future. So not only have a majority of Americans disapproved of Trump every day of his presidency, but an unprecedented majority now embraces ethnic diversity and racial equality, two essential pillars of true multiracial democracy. But translating this new multi-ethnic majority into a governing majority has been difficult. As all of you know, in our political system, the majority does not govern. Our founders created a system that was biased towards sparsely populated territories. The Electoral College is biased towards sparsely populated territories. States. The Senate is heavily biased towards sparsely populated states. And because the Senate approves Supreme Court justices, the Supreme Court is also biased towards sparsely populated states. Now, for most of US history, that institutional bias had no real partisan effect because both major parties had urban and rural wings. But today, over the last 20 years or so, the country, our parties are split along urban-rural lines. So the Democrats are overwhelmingly based in the cities. Republicans are overwhelmingly based in sparsely populated territories. That means that Republicans, through no fault of their own, have a systematic advantage in the Electoral College, in the Senate, and in the Supreme Court. Recent US elections fly directly in the face of majority rule. Republicans have won the popular vote for the presidency once in the last 20 years, and yet they've controlled the presidency for 12 of the last 20 years. Democrats easily won more votes in overall for the Senate in 2016 and in 2018, and yet Republicans still have a 53-seat majority in the Senate. This is minority rule. An electoral majority will not be enough to bring the Democrats to power in 2020. According to estimates by Nate Silver, if Biden wins the popular vote by 2 points, there is an 80% chance that Trump wins the presidency. If Biden wins by 3 points, Trump is still the favorite to win the presidency. Biden's got to win by 6 points in order to more or less have a lock on the presidency. The Senate's even worse. According to Silver's calculations, the Democrats have to win the popular vote by 7 points or more to ensure themselves a Senate majority. This problem, of course, is exacerbated by Republican efforts to dampen turnout among younger, lower income, and minority voters. Republican officials have purged voter rolls and closed down polling stations in universities, university towns, and predominantly African-American neighborhoods across the country. Since 2010, a dozen Republican-led states have passed laws making it considerably more difficult to register or to vote. Minority rule has skewed the composition of the Supreme Court. Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh are the first 2 Supreme Court justices in US history to be appointed by a president who lost the popular vote and then be confirmed by senators who represented less than half the American electorate. So the majority simply does not govern today in the United States, which means we desperately need reform. First and foremost, we need legislation that defends and expands the right to vote. H.R. 1, H.R. 4, which were passed by the House in 2019, but not by the Senate, would be an excellent start. H.R. 1 establishes automatic and same-day voter registration. It makes Election Day a national holiday. It expands early and absentee voting. It prohibits flawed purges of the voter rolls. It requires independent redistricting commissions to draw congressional maps, and it restores voting rights to convicted felons who have served their time. H.R. 4 would fully restore the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which of course was gutted by the Supreme Court in 2013. We also need reforms, in addition to voting reforms, that empower majorities, like eliminating the filibuster. Filibuster, which was rarely used during much of the 20th century, has now become a routine instrument of obstruction. All legislation, in effect, requires 60 votes, which amounts to a permanent minority party veto. Majority rule requires the elimination of the electoral college. Not going to be easy, but important. And it might also, I think, include offers of statehood to DC and to Puerto Rico. That would provide equal representation to Americans who are currently disenfranchised. Now, counter-majoritarian institutions are essential to democracy. This is what Republicans will push back and tell you. That's true. Institutions like the Bill of Rights, judicial review, federalism help and are critical to ensuring that individual liberties, that minority rights are protected under majority rule. Do not let them confuse you. Disenfranchisement is not a feature of liberal democracy. No other established democracy on earth has an electoral college or uses a filibuster. And a political system that repeatedly allows a minority party to control the most powerful office in the country is very difficult to call a democracy. Our choice is clear. We will either become a truly multiracial democracy or we will not be a democracy. A majority of Americans very clearly stands ready to embrace multi-ethnic democracy, but we need to get that majority into power. And for now, right now, that means mobilizing voters like never before. To overcome minority rule, we need to win a massive electoral majority. We are being, in effect, I had to use a sports metaphor, we're being forced to spot the other team a touchdown. But we can win if we mobilize young people. No group in the society is more committed to the multiracial democratic agenda than the youngest generation of voters. Young people oppose Trump by a nearly 3-to-1 margin, extraordinary margin, but they do not always vote. In fact, they vote at a much lower rate than older people. Athletes can reach younger voters, and it's my hope that they will spend the next couple of weeks using social media, using whatever media possible to persuade as many of them to vote as possible. Voting can be an adventure. Voting can be a social event. Voting can be an act of bravery. And crucially, voting can be an act of defiance. It's a way of saying fuck you to Trump. Getting young people to the polls is the simplest, is the most direct way of getting America's new Democratic majority to power. And that is how we will save our democracy. That's all I got. Thank you. Do we know who's next?
Well, great. It's great to be here with everyone. And this is so exciting. And thank you to Professor Levitsky for those very powerful and helpful framing comments. My name is Michael McBride. I am the National Director for the Live Free campaign, a national campaign that leads efforts to reduce gun violence and mass incarceration in Black and brown communities across the country, as well as get people to the polls to vote. And so I just got to start off by saying I hope all y'all folk out here who are watching, students, scholars, academics, homies, partners, comrades, Pookie, Ray Ray, Shanae, Hosea, Maria, whatever your name, whatever your hook, whatever your flavor is, I hope you know that early voting is happening literally all across the country. And next Tuesday, we have on literally the birthday of one of our great revolutionary athletes, Colin Kaepernick's birthday is on voting day. I hope all y'all take your soul, your body, your spirit to the polls and you vote. We're gonna have a super dope conversation with all kinds of people who have really stood in a space of intersection of both influence and activism. People who can help inspire us and clarify for us the need for us to engage in transformative change, change that is about our voice and about our actions. And so we got a star-studded panel of folks here, and I'm super excited to have the privilege to be able to help move this conversation along. And so let's just jump right on in it. I'm going to do a quick biographical introduction of each one of our panelists, and then bring them in to give us a few minutes of their own kind of story of self, so they can kind of introduce themselves to you and give you a sense of what drives their voice, their passion for speaking out against issues of concern. And then we're going to have a conversation towards the end and bring it all together and hopefully give us a roadmap on how all of us can use our voices, particularly as it relates to bringing about the kind of social change that we know is necessary. First, we're going to have Thaddeus Bullard, also known as Titus O'Neil. He's a wrestler with the WWE network, and he is an accomplished athlete, global entertainer, philanthropist, author of the book There's No Such Thing as a Bad Kid. I wish someone told me that when I was growing up. Somebody say amen, right? He was named as a finalist for the ESPN Muhammad Ali Sports Humanitarian Award and has donated, listen to this, over $10 million to support underserved youth, underserved youth, and has leveraged his influencer platform to engage diverse groups on a global scale. Come on, put in the chat, just welcome the great brother Thaddeus Bullard to the conversation. We have Midge Purce, who is a superstar. She is on the U.S. Women's National Soccer Team. She also plays for the Sky Blue in the soccer league. She graduated from Harvard in 2016 with a degree in psychology. While she was there, she captained the women's soccer team, was named the Ivy League Player of the Year twice, and she has recently been voted onto the Harvard Board of Overseers. Of note, she has started within her Players Collective, a Black women's player collective that has led efforts to ensure 100% of eligible Players Collective members in her soccer league are registered to vote. Put in the chat and let's welcome the great sister Midge Purce to the room and to the conversation. We have the great legend Anquan Boldin, a 14-year NFL veteran, Super Bowl champion. One time, he should have been twice with my 49ers, but we'll talk about that later. Co-founder of the Players Coalition. He's a global ambassador for Amnesty International, all-century honoree for Florida football and the fastest player to record 600 catches. He was named in 2016 the Walter Payton Man of the Year, which went to it's the highest honor for NFL players for their off-the-field impact. He is someone who has used his voice consistently to help raise issues of criminal justice reform and the impact of social injustice to impact communities. Put in the chat and let's welcome the great legend, Anquan Boldin. And finally, one of my comrades, Desmond Meade, will be joining us. He is a formerly homeless returning citizen, the president of the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition. He's the chair of Floridians for a Fair Democracy. He's a graduate of Florida International University College of Law. In 2018, Desmond, along with millions of Florida voters, helped to pass the historic Amendment 4 legislation that restored the right to vote to people with criminal convictions. And it was the largest expansion of voting rights since the Civil Rights Act. Over 1.4 million Floridians received their right to vote. He has been recognized as the Time Magazine 100 most influential people in the world. Desmond is one of my personal heroes, and I'm super glad to have him here. So we have Desmond Meade, we have Anquan Boldin, we have Sister Midge and Thaddeus all here to hang out with us and to give us a snapshot into what compels them to have their own voice being amplified for the cause of social justice. Now, I think it's really important for you and I to appreciate that part of what our task requires of us today is to be super clear about the moment we're facing. The professor has laid it out in a powerful manner, but I hope you appreciate and realize that much is at stake when our voices are silenced, when we are complicit, when we go along to get along in the face of injustice. And so I hope, I pray, we want to compel you, inspire you, and bring out from you the voice of your own story, your own passion, but also helping us to appreciate that when all of us lift up our voices together, as Dr. King says, we have a vague chorus or choir for justice. And I think that choir is what we need, the beautiful melody of justice and inclusion and peace and love to overwhelm and overtake this country. So to get us started, I'm super excited again to bring into the room the brother Thaddeus Bullard. Come on in the room, dear bro. Give us a sense of what makes you such a champion for using your voice, particularly at the intersection of family, faith, and sport. Why are you involved in democratic participation and changing the world? Brother Thaddeus, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks for having me, and thank you guys for putting this awesome panel together. For me, it all starts with how I was brought into this world. You know, I'm the product of a rape. My mother was raped at 11 years old and had me at the age of 12. Obviously, having to hop from house to house as a kid, sometimes not knowing where my next meal would be coming from, being on government housing as we got older, and being labeled a kid that would be dead or in jail by the time I was 16. I believed that for a greater period of my young adult life. And then I got an opportunity to go to a place called the Florida Sheriff's Boys Ranch. And it was there that I was not only had my eyes open into what it means to be, sheltered in a great environment, but also sheltered with love. And that love came from people from all different walks of backgrounds. And that love, essentially took me from a person that was an underperforming student to, an honor student in high school, honor student at the University of Florida, as well as a student athlete. And for years, my voice was kind of muted because I was a kid that had behavior issues, didn't really have respect for authority, didn't care much about the next person next to me because I felt like it needed to be about me because I essentially grew up with nothing. And so once I got to the boys ranch and was taught that there's no such thing as a bad kid and that I needed to start using my voice for positive things, even at 13 years old, I started using my voice in a positive manner, and it proved to be very powerful. And so as I got older, I realized that my influence was not just because I was an athlete, but also because I was willing to speak up. And I also had a power to bring people together. And at this point right now, where our country is, where so many people are divided on so many varying different issues, whether it be COVID-19 and the handling of the pandemic, or systemic issues within the justice system, systemic issues within education. Now is the time for all of us that have any type of voice to galvanize and bring people together from all walks of life to move forward in a manner in which we want them to move forward. And so I'm very adamant. I don't like politics whatsoever, probably because I ran for vice president of student government at Florida and won. And during my term at the University of Florida as vice president, I realized that I had zero desire to be involved in politics ever again. But then fast forward years later, I'm still have been able to utilize my voice, as you said, to not only bring awareness to different causes, but also to raise money and funds for different causes as well. And those stem in education, they stem in housing, they stem, and even right now with voter suppression, it's great to see guys that, you know, that I either played against or watched them play, like Anquan for years, not only at the high school level, but also in college and then obviously in professional leagues too. Each step I've seen him be a pillar in the community, and I've seen him galvanizing good people from all walks of life to move towards progress in one way, shape, or form. And so it's a beautiful, you know, feeling to know that we, you know, especially in times where people are told to shut up and dribble, shut up and shoot, shut up and run, that now more than ever, more athletes, Black, brown, white, etc., are now speaking out and using our voice. And November 3rd can't come and go quick enough for a lot of us. And as you said, you know, polls opened already for us to early vote, which is, you know, I'm actually, once we get done with this, I'm going down the road to vote myself. But it is very important for us to restore democracy in our country. And in one way that we all can do that is exercise our rights to vote, but also get other people to exercise their rights to vote. You know, you go into the average hood, you go into certain places in the world, and people say, well, it's just going to be the same old stuff anyway. Why would I need to vote? And in some cases, I look at that and I say, you know what? A lot of I feel the same way, or felt the same way. But I also feel like, you know, if we don't do anything, then we're just willing to accept everything that comes at us. And I just don't think at a time like this, where so many people have stepped up, the Colin Kaepernicks of the world, who have literally lost his career to stand for something. And along each generation, I think that there's been an athlete or an influencer that has lost a lot for the greater good of others. And Muhammad Ali lost 3 years of his prime career. Maya Moore lost time on her career in the WNBA, standing up for what she believed in. And now you see the shift of not only athletes and influencers, but businesses and corporations that are putting out statements in regards to Black Lives Matter and the importance of being able to be inclusive and diverse and accept the responsibility of what has been systemic issues within their own organizations and try to mitigate those things. And so it's not just about the election for who's the president of the United States, it's who's going to be your sheriff, who's going to be your county commissioners, who's going to be your school board heads and chairs, etc. So when you go and you vote, and I would never tell anyone who to vote for, I would say just go vote. You know, I'm involved in this campaign now for 2 years with Michelle Obama with the When We All Vote campaign, which is our sole purpose is to be a bipartisan effort to go out and get people registered to vote. That's the first step. You can't vote unless you're registered. Well, obviously now we're at a time now where every registered individual that we can possibly get out to the polls, whether you got to drive them, ride them on the back of a bicycle, take them on a moped, Uber them, however they got to get to the polls, we have to take our voices and our influence and get those people to those polls so that we can hopefully, all of us, regardless of where you stand, get the end result that you desire. And
Hold on, Daddy. We'll come back to you a little later on because I want to hear a little bit more about the ways in which your When We All Vote efforts are helping to inspire folks. But come on, y'all, put in a chat and let's just appreciate Thaddeus giving us that powerful overview of what drives him, right? And I mean that. I wish when I was young that book was out because it had been given to all my teachers talking about there's no such thing as a bad kid, because I sure enough was described as one growing up. Come on, Midge, jump on in here and tell us a little bit about your journey around democratic participation. What fuels you? What drives you? And how have you been able to engage your own comrades in your sport in not only voter participation, but just caring more about the issues beyond the sport?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of what fuels me and what drives me, I think ever since I was younger, my family actually made it very clear that voting was not really, it wasn't an option to our family. It was a necessity. And my aunt Margaret, she would always tell me, you'd be a fool not to speak up in matters that you have a hand in, a deciding factor in, where you can contribute to making a difference. And I wholeheartedly believe that. I think recently the words of John Lewis have really struck me. And I think when I hear voting and his quote about it being the most powerful nonviolent tool we have to create a more perfect union, that is what resonates with me most powerfully at the moment. But getting other people to vote, that has been that has been a journey. Yeah, I mean, my generation historically isn't the one with the highest turnout. We don't go out to vote, but we have a lot of passionate views that I think are seen in protests that you see out in the streets on various issues. But when it comes to the voting, actually going to the polls, you don't see that translation and people showing up. And I think that right now it has just been really, really important to resolve that disconnect between people being passionate about things, having real issues with the way that things are run in government or the way that our society is operating, but not taking the necessary actions to contribute to changing those issues in the system. So that's really where that came from. And our Black Women's Player Collective, which are in the I play for the National Women's Soccer League, and we have just recently created the Black Women's Player Collective. And as it was mentioned, we have 100% voting registration within that collective, which, yeah, which is really exciting because obviously we have girls from different markets, like all over the country. So there were different rules for everyone, different standards for them to get it through. And it was a really, really rewarding task to complete when we got everyone registered.
Wow. No, that's amazing. And again, I think we take it for granted how courageous it must have, or the courage you had to tap into in order to do that in the space you were in. And so we certainly salute you and thank you for your voice and the way you're using it. And we're going to come back and pull all y'all into a conversation a little bit more. Let's bring in the great Anquan Boldin. You are no rookie to this game of activism and social justice. You've had a long career of not just doing on the field magic, but also making sure that you never forget the folks in the communities that have produced you. So talk a little bit about what drives you. You know, what were the experiences that were seminal in helping produce the Anquan Boldin that has been and continues to be the perpetual man of the year. Give us a sense of what drives you, good bro.
Thank you. And I would say, man, you know, big shout out to everybody that's on this webcast, man. Everybody that's putting in work because it's definitely needed. Guys like Thaddeus, man, Midge. And I've worked with, you know, a couple people, Desmond Meade, on the voters' rights campaign here in Florida. Restoring voter rights to 1.4 million people was huge for us. So we were glad to see that go through last November. But for me, it's been about my upbringing. I come from a less fortunate area, right down here in South Florida, Pahokee to be exact. I mean, there's not a lot going on. You know what I'm saying? Over 50% of the people live below the poverty line, and you see the disadvantages that people of color have coming up. Obviously, as a young kid, it's almost considered normal. A lot of the things that we went through. I can remember as a kid, me and my friends going to a store and only being allowed to come in one at a time. And for us, that was, everyday life. And then you get a little older and you get out and experience the world, and you start to think back on those things, and you was like, man, like that's messed up. Like, me and 4 of my friends couldn't go inside of a grocery store, you know what I'm saying? Because they were suspicious of us stealing or whatever it was, just because of the color of our skin. And I just remember growing up, man, just always wanting to give back to my community, being able to give opportunities to kids that I didn't have. And, initially starting out in the NFL, my second year in the NFL, I can remember starting a foundation. And that was my goal, to provide opportunities to kids that I didn't have growing up. And as my career went along, that expanded. We started helping more families, more kids, started a scholarship foundation to help graduating seniors, so on and so forth. And then my last year in San Francisco, something happened. And for me, it was life-changing. I'm just like everybody else. I've seen all of the police shootings and all of those things that happen on TV. And although you're sympathetic to it, and you're compassionate about those issues, when it happens to you and your family, it hits different. And my last year in San Francisco, my cousin was killed by a law enforcement officer. And my cousin was in a band, he was a drummer, and he was on his way home from a gig one night, and he broke down on the side of the road. And long story short, while he was on the phone with roadside assistance, he ended up getting shot 3 times by an undercover officer.
Wow.
And the only saving grace about that was the story that the officer told didn't match up with the recording from roadside assistance. He had no idea that he was being recorded. And it's so crazy because on the other side of the phone, you can hear the operator say, "Oh my God, he just shot him." And for me, that was life-changing because my cousin had never been in any kind of trouble with the law. Matter of fact, he was a model citizen, worked for the state of Florida, and just because of the color of his skin, him breaking down on the side of the road cost him his life. And for me, I knew it was no longer a situation where I could sit back and watch these things happen in our country. It was a must that I get involved in. And that's what led me to help found the Players Coalition, which is a group of players in the NFL, both current and former players, who are just tackling issues when it comes to criminal justice reform, police community relations, economic advancement. That is my sole purpose right now. And getting out to vote is a part of that. I think about one of the things that happened was my cousin was probably one of the only people to receive justice, right? And after the cop got convicted of the crime of the murder, my family was happy, right? We were happy that justice was served. But then I soon found out that this was the first officer who was convicted on a police involved shooting in the last 30 years in the state of Florida. And you think about how many police involved shootings happened over the last 30 years. And those families not only didn't receive justice, but a lot of those families didn't get a day in court. And that was heartbreaking for me. So I've been on a mission, man, to make sure that we hold those that are in positions of power accountable. I'm on a mission to make sure that we get as many people involved in our democratic process as possible. Because having a state attorney like the state attorney that we had was big, because a lot of state attorneys don't have the gall to prosecute law enforcement, right? And a lot of times we complain about those things, but we have to realize that we're the ones who put them in positions. we're the ones who vote district attorneys and state attorneys in. That's the power that we have with our vote. That's why I'm so adamant about getting as many people to the polls as possible. That's why I'm in an effort to not only get people registered to vote, but to educate people on who they're voting for, the policies that these people are pushing. And also, we just did a deal down here in Palm Beach County with Palm Tran to make sure that people get a ride to the polls.
Wow.
From the beginning of early voting, which was the 19th of this month, to the 31st, and then on November 3rd also, we have free rides to the polls for anybody that need them from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. Every day, early voting and on the day of voting. So there's a lot of work going on. I'm appreciative to everybody that's joined in this fight because all of the help is needed.
Yeah, man. Come on, y'all. Show some love to the great Anquan Boldin. Just so much transparency. And it is indeed the case. You know, I was not super involved in issues of police brutality and reform. I'm a fourth generation Pentecostal kid. That just means, you know, I grew up in the church where you spoke in tongues, swung from the chandelier and rolled on the floor and was just waiting to go to heaven. And then I got beat up by some cops in 1999 in San Jose. And it was indeed the most transformative moment in my life because it required me to take a hard look at the issues that were affecting us in the here and now. And I always tell people, you should not wait until this tragedy hits your own family to get involved. And so much love to you and to those who are responding, you know, to this in real time. I think Desmond has come in the room. But before I go to you, D, I want to come back to Midge because I do want you talked about from passion to action. And you know, I know we got a whole bunch of fellas on here talking, but you know, I want to give you a little bit of extra moments, you know, to opine about how did you actually bring the Black Women's Player Collective from an idea into a reality? How were you able to move from passion to action? Any quick thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the wake of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, when the country was in this really heightened state of turmoil, our league went into a bubble. And you could see that our teams were very, very fragmented when it came to racial issues. And it was no secret because we had, you know, people protesting during the anthem or kneeling. And it was like just a bar graph. People were kneeling, people weren't kneeling. And the teams were very disjointed on and off the field. And the conversations about race in the bubble, they were not only exhausting, but they were very, very concerning. And it was happening across every team. And what I personally found was that I wasn't arguing about positions or opinions or about the right way to go about things or resolve issues. I was arguing about facts and veracity, about what's true and what's not true. And I think that's a really huge problem. Arguments, disputes, debates, those are all wonderful things. And I think they're central to any free democracy. But when we're arguing and when we're in a place where the facts don't matter and where the value of truth is so weak that even individuals in the government can make truth whatever they want it to be, that's not okay. So I and the other Black women in the league decided to collectively take steps to fight against the reality of systemic racism, to progress the accessibility of football to young Black girls in the United States, and directly address indoctrinated history, along with so many other things. And that's really where that all came from. And
were people just like open arms, like, come on, bitch, girl, you the homie, we love you, girl, we've been waiting on you? Or did you get any pushback or resistance? Because sometimes I think it's important to just share. Sometimes there was a struggle, sometimes it wasn't. But I'm curious, how accepting were folks from the beginning? Did you win people over?
No. No, it had its obstacles for sure. I think even just we're actually joining the Players Coalition, and that's been super helpful to us in trying to achieve everything that we're doing. So thank you for paving the way so that you walk so we can run. but no, it was really difficult, and it's still difficult. To be honest with you, it's not like we have 100% support. We're in a league where we make up black women in our league are 7.5% of the league. So it's not the same as football or the WNBA. So our issues and our obstacles are different.
Well, I want y'all to just please celebrate Midge and all of the Black Women's Player Collective, because sometimes when you are that kind of numerical minority in any organization, you do feel the pressure. But much props to you for standing up, and you ain't standing up by yourself. You got the ancestors and the homies standing with you. Shoot, if I could play soccer as good as a woman, I may come join the league to help you, but then we have a whole other set of problems, I think. All right, Desmond, we coming to you, bro. We coming to you right now because we want to just give you a chance to join the conversation. I've been knowing Desmond for so many years, so this is the homie, this is the comrade. Desmond, y'all don't know this, in another life was a Black preacher, which means that, you know, he has the gift of gab, praise God. But Desmond, I'm gonna invite you to not be a Black preacher today. I'm gonna invite you to you know, talk within a time limit, because we want to get to a conversation with you, Anquan, Midge, and Thaddeus. I know, I'm surprised you're not on that bus, bro. But I guess we're gonna get on that bus in the next couple of days. So great Desmond Meade, the president of the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition. Come on in the room, man, and just tell us a little bit about not just your story, but also what you are doing in real time to make sure we can get these loved ones able to vote. And I know you're looking for your book, probably.
Yeah, that's right. If you want to know my story, you got to buy my book. About the only one on here right now that probably get it is Anquan and Thaddeus. They might go ahead and get a free autographed copy, but everybody else got to buy the book if you want to hear that story, man. and Pastor Mike, let me tell you, I ain't playing no soccer either, man, because I don't even have the stamina for that. But I'm definitely standing with my sisters in solidarity. But no, I am someone who's directly impacted. You know, just about a little over a month ago, I voted for the first time in over 30 years. And that was an amazing and transformational experience. You know, as an advocate for voting rights and criminal justice reform, I've always, or at least while I was an advocate, understood the importance of voting. But man, me actually voting took it to a whole new level. And I think, you know, like my story is pretty much well known, going from being homeless, hooked on crack, and recently released from prison, and to be standing in front of railroad tracks, waiting on the train to come, to jump in front of it, to not having that train come, and to cross those tracks and check myself into treatment. After completing that, going to a homeless shelter, while there enrolling in school and progressing all the way towards getting a law degree from FIU College of Law, and of course leading the Amendment 4 efforts. Man, yeah, that's a great story, man. But man, for this call, I'm telling you, there's a much, to me, a bigger story for this moment. It's that story of that brother that messaged me this morning, that said that he finally pulled the veil away, and he finally admitted that all of these years that he's been being so-called apathetic towards voting and civic engagement. You know, the ones that be like, man, my vote don't matter. It don't matter who get in office, right? They say that kind of stuff. That deep down inside, he was jealous of people that was voting. And just yesterday, he was able to vote for the very first time in his entire life, and how he had to go back to his car and sit in there and cry like a baby, right? And I could feel that, you know, because it reminded me of a young lady just a couple months ago who dying wish was to be able to vote, right? And unfortunately, she died before getting that opportunity. But I think those are the stories, man, that transcend all of this. It actually even transcend the politics, you know, and everything else. It takes us to a space that really celebrate and embrace our humanity, right? That God has created each and every one of us to be not only treated with dignity and respect, but to also be heard, right? And to be a part of this. And so I'm excited about the work that we're doing, working with returning citizens and getting them engaged in the democratic process, and taking on all oncomers, right? That is, you know how it goes. They come at you, we hit them with the crossbar, you know, and put them on their back, right? We clap back on them, right? And you know about the crack back,
Desmond,
right, Anquan?
Desmond,
I'm not gonna preach, but
no. I was gonna say you do that figuratively. I hope, right? We
no, we are doing that through showing up to vote, right?
Yeah.
And that's
Okay,
the thing.
gotcha.
Like what we doing this on Saturday with our free to vote. We're saying that how we respond to people that try to suppress our vote, people that try to intimidate us or dissuade us from voting, we respond by showing up in greater numbers, right? That we're not cowering, that our democracy is worth fighting for, worth standing up for, especially when we think about what our ancestors have gone through, right? And the suffering that they had. And so that's how we're responding to it. We're going to hit it with the crossbar, whatever we got to do, but we know that we're not running and we're not staying at home, because that right there makes those cowards winners, right?
All
So
right. The great Desmond Meade, he gonna raise an offering in a second. Y'all keep letting him talk. Listen. We got a lightning round. Got about 8 more minutes before we bring on our next group of professors. But I want to hit y'all with some of these questions. Thaddeus, I'm coming to you because I remember when we talked a couple times, you talked about how you wanted to make sure we were doing work beyond voting day, and I think you touched on that even at the top of your remarks. So just in a few seconds, talk about a little bit about what you're planning to do beyond voting day to make sure we can transform some of the conditions in our community.
Well, to me, everything changed for me with education. And so I've been very active in making sure that, you know, much similar to what LeBron James did up in Akron, Ohio, I did here in Tampa and adopted a school that's in East Tampa. That's been an F school for 18 years now. We've been able to celebrate the highest grade increase in the entire school district, 8th in the state and 11th in the nation. Changing the culture, getting people more aware of how important building relationships is in the process of moving forward and making change. You can't ask somebody for a loan if you don't know who to go ask. And so bringing those resources into the underserved community, but also bringing those that are in the underserved community and putting them in and exposing them to things outside of where they're from. A lot of times people's eyes open up. You know, a lot of times I might take a kid from the hood and say, hey, I'm gonna take you over to Orlando, to Lake Nona, to the USTA's facility. Hey man, I ain't playing no tennis. I can't play no tennis. Well, how you know you can't play tennis if you ain't ever even tried? And then they kick in and scratching all the way over on the bus to go over, and then once they get over there, it's hard to get them off the tennis court. For me, it's just about continuing to make everyone aware of the importance of building relationships. And some of them have been strained because of their relationship and what they've seen in their community with law enforcement. Some of it have been seen with what they've seen in education. Some of it has been seen when they see with housing, when people with landlords, you know, that have not been forgiving, especially during this time of COVID. And so building affordable housing in this area of town, East Tampa.
So I hear you saying housing, I hear you saying education. You're using your platform to help inspire concrete change.
And build relationships. You can't do things without people being able to understand who to go to, where to go to, why are you going to them, and why are these people coming to help me? Because in the Black community, especially, the one thing that is consistent is inconsistency, whether it be their home life and being able to live a certain place for 4 months, 5 months, and then they got to move again. Or mom's got one boyfriend this week, and the next week they got another boyfriend, or dad's got a girlfriend, and the next week this your stepmom, etc. They're used to inconsistency. So what we have to do is teach people how to build relationships that are consistent and built on the right thing, which is truth. And once people understand your truth and you hear somebody else's truth, it puts you in a position, whether you agree or disagree, to at least be able to move forward because you know where each other lies in their perspectives.
Yeah. Anquan, why don't you and Midge jump in on this? Particularly, he talked about building relationships. There is, you know, nothing more interesting than the passion of a fan, right? Like, you know, we love y'all as long as you're wearing our team jersey, and then you got to be a heck of a player for us to love you when you playing against you in the Super Bowl. And I had that experience when the Baltimore Ravens broke my heart, and then the next year he literally came on over to the Niners. I had to cheer for the man that kept us from winning our 6th ring. So talk a little bit, Anquan and Midge, about the unique role of why athletes have such a powerful platform and why your voice is so influential in the larger culture. We'll start with you, Quan, and then we'll go to Midge.
Yeah, I feel like as an athlete, I think it's an obligation. And I've said it before. For whatever reason, when athletes speak, people listen, whether they agree with it or disagree. But it always catches people's attention. And I think anytime you have people's attention in that light, you have to speak truth to it. And I heard Thaddeus talking, man. It's about addressing the needs of the disenfranchised, the historically disenfranchised. And I think, in the time that we're living in, especially like in the midst of a pandemic, I think those issues have only been magnified. You look at like education, for an example, kids being, at home, not having internet access, the disenfranchised continue to be that way. So I think for us, it's important to continue to address those needs. And that's what we're trying to do as athletes, man. We're not detached from it. We come from it. We have family members who are still going through it. No amount of money that we've made has disconnected us from the communities that we've come up in. And that's the thing that we have to continue to keep in mind. Those are the things that we have to continue to fight for, because there's a lot of people that are depending on us. We have been exposed to a lot of things that a lot of people who come from where we come from will never get exposed to. So it's on us to give them that exposure. It's on us to give them that knowledge. It's on us to educate them about the things that are going on around us. A lot of things in our country happen because people just don't know, flat out. But when you know, you can begin to address those things. And that's where we are, trying to educate people. And once we educate them, we can begin to map out a game plan on how we address these issues, whether they be doing voting, whether they be in legislation, however that looks. But it's about addressing the needs of the communities that we come from.
Yeah, the more you know, the more you owe. Absolutely. Midge, what would you say? What makes your platform as an athlete so unique?
I really don't know the exact reason why people are so interested in what what we have to say, but similarly, I agree it's an obligation, and I think it's a blessing. I do. I think it has something to do with the fact that when you see someone doing something that's impressive or interesting to you, it then makes you more fascinated about, oh, I wonder what they're thinking. Or it's kind of like seeing a teacher outside of school. You're like, oh, you exist off the court. Like, how do you function in this space? And that's just fascinating inherently. But no, I think when I discovered that there was someone else besides my father who cared about what it is that I was saying, it was even more inspiring to me to want to do more things that serviced others in ways that were completely unrelated to the sport that I play. I said it was a blessing, and I just want to double down on that, because to have people value not just a skill that you have or an asset that you've displayed, but something so unrelatable where you can contribute to this entirely other just dimension of the world, like whether it's politics, whether it's the climate, whether it's economics, whether it's nonprofits. I think it's just an amazing thing.
Well, I just want to appreciate the opportunity to hear y'all's voices. This has been so inspirational and important. Desmond, I'm gonna give you the final quick word. And after Desmond speaks, I'm excited to have David Harris. He is the managing director of the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice at Harvard Law School. His predecessor, Professor Ogletree, has been a huge, towering figure of just wisdom, and I'm just so blessed to be able to be connected to all of these folks, man. I'm telling y'all, y'all don't understand how precious of a gathering of influencers and impactful folks we've just experienced. And so please hang out with us, because I think we're going to bring folks back and have some further conversations. But Desmond, take us on out like a good Black preacher would do in your other life. And then the next voice you'll hear is Brother David Harris.
You're muted.
You're muted.
Brother Meade.
Oh, all right, I'm back. Thank you so much. I just want to just really recognize how honored I am to be among socially conscious athletes, and just to really testify to the fact that it has been making a substantial impact in our communities. I believe that, we've heard the adage that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And I believe that applies also to our society and to our communities, that if we do want to become a great community, if we want to become a great country, a greater country, we must empower those that are weakest among us. And I do believe that if we commit to that and we do so out of love, that there's nothing, no obstacle, no distraction that we can't overcome and create a better environment for all of us. And so I'm looking forward to continuing the engagement with athletes. I'm looking forward to continuing the work, knowing that we are doing God's work, and I'm just appreciative of the opportunity to be a servant. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you all. It's really it's hard to step into Pastor Mike's shoes here. Pastor Mike is one of my heroes and has been for a long, long time, and to be able to work with him and have his voice as part of this conversation has been special in joining you all. So, I think everybody in the chat ought to give all of you, give you your props and great thanks. And at this point, we're going to pivot a little bit. And we're fortunate to have with us a couple of thought leaders on democracy. We're really pleased to have with us today Professor Alex Keyssar, Professor Franita Tolson, who will provide us with a historical perspective on voter suppression and comparisons to our current situation. Professor Keyssar is Matthew W. Sterling Sterling Jr. Professor of History and Social Policy at Harvard University. He's an historian by training, but has specialized in the exploration of historical problems that have contemporary policy implications. And here we are, right? His book, The Right to Vote, The Contested History of Democracy in America, in the United States, published in 2000, was named the best book in US history by both the American Historical Association and the Historical Society. It was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the Los Angeles Times Book Award, and is really one of the classic pieces of scholarship in our country. In 2004 and 2005, he chaired the Social Science Research Council's National Research Commission on Voting and Elections, and he writes frequently for popular press about American politics and the history and history. His latest book, entitled "Why Do We Still Have the Electoral College?", which we're all wondering moment to moment, is published by the Harvard University Press. We also are really blessed to have with us today Professor Franita Tolson, the Vice Dean for Faculty and Academic Affairs and Professor of Law at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law, where she focuses on election law, constitutional law, legal history, and employment discrimination. She has written on topics including partisan gerrymandering, again, incredibly timely, political parties, the Elections Clause, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the 14th and 15th Amendments. These are all our topics. Her book, "In Congress We Trust, Enforcing Voting Rights from the Founding to the Jim Crow Era," will be published in 2021 by Cambridge University Press. As a nationally recognized expert in election law, Professor Tolson has testified before the House Judiciary Committee on the Voting Rights Act and authored a legal analysis for an amendment to the US Constitution explicitly protecting the right to vote. She works as an election law analyst for CNN and hosts the election-themed podcast, Free and Fair with Franita and Foley, with Ned Foley. Prior to joining USC, Vice Dean Tolson was the Betty T. Ferguson Professor of Voting Rights at Florida State University College of Law. And with that, I turn it over to you, Professor Keyssar.
Thank you very much, David. I want to start by saying how honored I am to be a part of this group, and how it's been very interesting for me to listen and to learn. And dialogues of this sort are something we really need to do more often to help each other accomplish our work. And I've just been very impressed by the work that all the previous speakers have been doing. I thought that what I could contribute here would be a few comments about the history of voting rights and as they evolve to the present, and a few comments also then about voter suppression. There's a kind of classical, elementary school textbook. It's actually the Congressional Quarterly view of the history of voting rights in the United States. Everybody knows that the franchise was much narrower at the country's origin, at the end of the 18th century, the early 19th century. Basically, the franchise was restricted to adult white property-owning males. And then we know in the standard history as well, then the franchise expanded. Property requirements are dropped. The 15th Amendment is passed enfranchising African Americans. The 19th Amendment is passed enfranchising women. And then of course, it's a little weird because, and then the Voting Rights Act is passed enfranchising African Americans again. And somehow it's like, well, why did it have to happen again? But it's a story the story is told as a story simply of progress, but that really distorts what happened in our history. The expansion, the right to vote has expanded, but it has been a history of conflict and a history of 2 steps forward and one step back. It has not been smooth. People did not simply wake up one day and say, oh, wouldn't it be nice to get rid of property requirements? That seems reasonable, or any other gesture towards inclusion. It came from organization and struggle and political organization. To pick an arcane, I mean, we know this about the civil rights movement of the 1960s. We know this about the suffrage movement, women's suffrage movement of the 19th and early 20th centuries, but even in other ways, an obscure, but I think revealing example has to do with dropping property requirements for voting in the early 19th century. That didn't just happen. It happened because in the War of 1812, soldiers were recruited largely from the ranks of men who did not own property. And those men gathered together to fight in the war. And, something remarkable happened. They began talking to each other. And then they started organizing each other to say, why is it that we should be called to fight for the country if we're not allowed to vote? And they created a political movement leading to their enfranchisement. And that stories like that are the norm. And there have also been moments when the franchise has been undermined or undercut. In fact, there's a rhythm to some of these changes. And it's a rhythm which we see in the 19th century, and it's repeated in recent years, and I really want to underscore it. That rhythm seems to be that there are movements that are created that press for the actual legal enfranchisement of particular groups of people, whether on class, racial, or gender lines. And then in the wake of achieving that goal, then there is a counter movement that can't quite do full-scale disenfranchisement again, but engages in voter suppression. I mean, I distinguish between disenfranchisement and voter suppression. As disenfranchisement is when you have a law that blanketly keeps a group from voting. Voter suppression is when you put lots of obstacles in the path of legal voters and keep them from casting their votes. So what we see at the end of the 19th century, of course, is the end of the Civil War, the end of slavery, the passage of the 15th Amendment, and then that is followed by a period of reaction and extreme voter suppression, which borders on disenfranchisement again in the South. But also want to note and add to this conversation, there's a class dimension. To a lot of this is aimed at poor people regardless of race, because in the northern United States, there are also laws passed, less draconian, less backed by violence, but there are laws passed to try to keep immigrant voters from voting. Literacy tests are not the product of the South. They come out of Massachusetts. New York State passes an English language literacy test to vote in 1921, and that is enforced into the mid-1960s. Similarly, in our more recent history, I think that what we are looking at is something that has parallels, which is with the passage of the Voting Rights Act and other steps that were taken in the 1960s, African Americans have once again, as was true briefly after the 15th Amendment, achieved some political power. And we also live in a period of very large-scale immigration. So we have in effect, lots of new participants in the political system, coming both among African Americans and among immigrants. And what we are seeing in the last 20 to 30 years is a rising tide of reaction against that. I mean, Steve Levitsky framed it very well at the outset. These are people who do not want to surrender power, and yet if elections were allowed to be democratic, if the vote was easy to exercise, power would shift in this country. So I guess the final things I want to say is that it's always a struggle, and democracy, I've written this elsewhere, democracy isn't a state of affairs that we achieve once and for all. It's an ongoing project. It requires vigilance. It requires work on the part of all of us. And the fact that this notable group of athletes is doing that work in this particular period is beyond commendable. Let me stop there.
Thank you. I mean, I think this is a great time to transition to that process, Professor Tolson, and kind of share a little bit with us your thoughts on the kind of post-Jim Crow, or following up on Professor Keyssar.
Yeah, of course. First, let me say I'm very happy to be here. I think that the first panel was just a really rich and inspiring look into efforts to protect the right to vote today. And it also sort of reflects the excitement and interest in the upcoming election, which is also in part because American democracy is essentially at a crossroads. Voter suppression is on the rise precisely because it is a necessary tool to ensure the continued dominance of a political minority. And voter suppression, disenfranchisement, minority rule, though, if left unchecked, will be the very thing that destroys our system of government if we don't do something about it. Importantly, voter suppression is contextual, right? So many of the laws that we take for granted can actually be suppressive depending on the context. For example, voter registration was once a suppression technique, even though we now accept it as a necessary precondition to becoming a qualified voter. But even legal restrictions can be suppressive. It is these very legal restrictions that elected officials are most trying to exploit, and the courts have done little to protect the right to vote in response to it. For example, the Sixth Circuit restored Michigan's ban on providing free transportation for people to get to the polls. Similarly, the Seventh Circuit upheld an Indiana law which permitted those over 65 to vote by mail, while denying the same privilege to those under 65 who now needed an excuse to do so. The 11th Circuit made it difficult for those with felony convictions to vote by requiring payments of all fines and fees prior to casting a ballot. And finally, the Supreme Court issued a recent decision on Alabama to allow that state to prevent curbside voting, which is a significant help to elderly voters and voters with disabilities. Many of these restrictions upheld by courts are either reinforcing historical disenfranchisement techniques like felon disenfranchisement, or mimicking historical efforts to disenfranchise by raising the cost of participation. COVID-19 has also exacerbated the situation. So we see many of these restrictions bearing fruit in recent primaries where voters waited 4, 5, and sometimes 6 hours in line to vote in the middle of a pandemic. We see similar things in the general election. Georgia, people were in line 8, 9, 10 hours. Right now, there are at least 200 COVID voting related cases in over 40 states to address some of this. And sadly, the right to vote seems to be losing, right? And it's losing despite the fact that many of our current voting practices have their basis in laws enacted in states during the late 19th century for the express purpose of disenfranchising African Americans, poor whites, and also suppressing the vote. Most of these suppression efforts did not technically violate the US Constitution, at least as that document was then interpreted. In fact, the adoption of discriminatory state constitutions in the 1890s was mostly race neutral. Mississippi in particular was relentless in its quest to disenfranchise African Americans and eliminate any prospect of federal oversight in its elections. In 1890, the state was the first to call a convention to amend its constitution and change its voter qualifications. The state constitution introduced an onerous residency rule, requiring that voters live in a state for 2 years and be registered 4 months before the next election. So compare that to current complaints about having to wait 30 days to register, right? The Mississippi Constitution also imposed a literacy test that required potential voters to read a provision of the state constitution. It also instituted a poll tax of $2 that was successful in disenfranchising African American voters in most of Mississippi's counties. Historically, a poll tax was a tax paid as a precondition to voting. And in fact, it was one of the most effective barriers to voting ever devised. Mississippi, through its efforts, served as a model for other states that sought to emulate its success with disenfranchising African Americans. Its constitution cut African American turnout from 30% in the 1888 presidential election to virtually nothing thereafter. Importantly, many of these changes were legal at the time, and it was not until the 1960s that there was significant federal intervention to outlaw some of these practices. But the end result was that efforts to suppress merely evolved, but did not disappear. In particular, the poll tax, which is now illegal, was a way to exploit wealth distinctions and systemic inequality that disproportionately affected people of color. Voter ID laws, proof of citizenship requirements, and felon disenfranchisement, as well as conditions imposed on felon reenfranchisement, replicate these inequalities, even though these laws remain legal. This attack on voting rights and the judiciary's refusal to do anything about it stands as the most obvious indicator that our democracy is failing. Underlying the court's abdication of their duties is the belief that our elections and our institutions will continue to survive even if we exclude those who these institutions are supposed to serve. However, the survival of America requires us to understand that America is not inevitable and that voter suppression and voter disenfranchisement can be our undoing. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. It's, it's fascinating. I think most of us, think that these voter suppression practices and things are limited to the South and limited to the past. And, it is fascinating to know that a lot of this is going on in the Midwest and in the North. And, I wonder, there's a proposal to restore the Voting Rights Act, which really actually kind of focused on a certain number of Southern states. And I'm curious what you think about the kind of geographic dispersion of these voter suppression practices.
Franita,
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to jump in. So we do focus on the South, mostly because of things that happened in the wake of the Civil War, but voter suppression was universal. There was plenty of electoral fraud in the North. There were suppression techniques used in the North as well. And I know that the bill that has passed the House and is sitting in the Senate to reauthorize a portion of the Voting Rights Act would apply nationwide. So at least initially, it would target those states that have, I think 10 or more voting rights violations in the last 10 years or 15 years. I forget the time limit, but the idea behind the provision is to tie pre-clearance to more recent voting rights violations. And it's not geographically limited because of that. So if you have a northern state that commits violations, a northern state would also be subject to pre-clearance. So I do think to some extent at least the prospects of legislation has moved past this focus on the South. because there are states like Wisconsin where you have suppressed, terrible voter suppression and terrible partisan gerrymandering and things of that nature that has really affected the political power of racial minorities in other states as well, right? So Pennsylvania has gotten a lot of attention because this election infrastructure is quite terrible, and minority groups in Philadelphia and other urban areas have a more difficult time voting. And so to the extent that the Voting Rights Act and there are proposals out there, it's very good that they've moved past the exclusive focus on the South and recognize that this is a nationwide problem.
Yeah, if I could just chime in for a second, I agree completely with that we have to focus on this as a national phenomenon. I mean, strategically, it's right also that objections of singling out a region seem to be fairly strong, but democracy is a national value, and it should apply, and enforcing it and making sure it's present is something that should happen everywhere.
Well, thank you both. I'm hoping that that maybe the first panelists will rejoin us now. I'm sorry, I think we're going to try to handle a few questions. There's one question that's been sitting with us for quite a while, and it is simply an audience member would love to hear from any of the athletes about how to keep the civic engagement momentum going after the election. Voting, as this person says, voting is not an every 4-year activity. Local elections and ballot measures are voted on every year. What are your suggestions for keeping this going? Now, several of you mentioned the need to do this, and so a member of the audience is curious about your thoughts about how to make that happen.
Yeah, I would just say, for us as a Players Coalition, one thing we've done was continue to stay engaged. Like you said, voting isn't an every 4-year thing. There are elections all of the time. Most of those being your local and your state elections, and those are more important than your presidential elections, right? Because those are the elections that affect your everyday lives. One thing that we have done and made a concerted effort to do was to continue to educate people about voting, about job titles. We've had public forums, community forums, where we invite those that are running to come out, and we invite the community to come out as well. And we let the community know these are the people that want to serve you, and we let them know these are the policies that they stand behind, these are the things that they believe in, these are the things that they're pushing. And we allow the community the opportunity to ask them questions. And I think that's real important, because there's a lot of forums that we've been in, especially like district attorney forums, where people don't even know who their local DA is. They don't even know what that job entails. And when you allow the community to come out and you educate them in this way, I think they become more involved in the voting process. It's something that piques their interest, and it lets them know that you do have a voice. A lot of times people talk and they think that they're helpless and, with the things that are going on around them, but you do have power, especially with your vote. Your vote is powerful. If your vote wasn't powerful, they wouldn't be trying to do so many things to stop you from voting. So I think just educating the public and keeping them engaged in the things that's going on, the issues that they care about.
Thank you. Yeah. Thaddeus, Thaddeus or Desmond, you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say echo what he said as far as keeping people engaged, but more importantly, it's great to vote, and it's great to get people fired up about whether it be a protest, etc. But I think we need to take more of a hard stance of holding people accountable. These people that have been held and put into office, that you hear from them, once when it's time to run for office, when they want to, they want you to give a donation to their campaign. They want you to endorse them. They want you to support them in a bill that they're going to put forth to legislature. But then you don't hear from them anymore. And I think a lot of people, especially those in underserved and underrepresented communities, need to do a better job of holding the people that are in office accountable. Because once they realize that folks are they're looking for you to do exactly what you said that you would do, and not only looking for you to do what you said you would do, but even offer and lend a hand to help in the process of you fulfilling whatever platform issues that you ran on when you were running for office. In order for you to uphold those and to follow through on those promises that you made, you're going to need help. You're going to need help from both the legislative branch that you're serving within. You're going to need help with your constituents, and you're going to need help that those that even opposed you on the other side during the election process. And so my big thing has always been, you know, if I tell somebody, if Thaddeus Boldin says I'm going to be somewhere at 8 o'clock in the morning and I'll be there all week, I'm going to be there all week. And if I'm not there all week, I'm almost positive that somebody, one of my teammates or a coworker or a friend is going to say, man, you say he's going to be here at 8 o'clock and you weren't here. We got to do the same thing for these elected officials. Hold them accountable. Keep their feet to the fire. Never let them get comfortable, because the minute they get comfortable, things start to slip and the progress is stalled. And so in order to prevent that from happening, hold these people accountable, man. There's nothing wrong with speaking up. You can blow their phones up 24/7, and you can march all you want to do, but until you start actually putting things in place that make sure that, hey, I voted for you, and people like me voted for you, and my friends voted for you. Now we want to see you, you know, do what you said that you were going to do.
Thank you. Professor Tolson, did you have something to say too?
So I think one of the powerful lessons of this year, in the wake of the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others that sparked worldwide protests, is that I think society has to start viewing protesting and voting as in partnership, as opposed to viewing them as an either or. Because if anything, the election of the first Black woman mayor of Ferguson is proof positive of that, because the protests in Ferguson started after the death of Michael Brown, and they kept up that activism, and it led to the election of the first Black woman mayor. And this is an area where historically African Americans have been treated poorly by both the criminal justice system and more broadly. And so they were able to change things in part because they kept the heat on. So I definitely agree with earlier comments about the importance of voting and changing systems through formal mechanisms. But it's also important to recognize the momentum that comes from political activism as well, and hitting the ground and protesting and sort of making our voices heard that way, because voting and protesting are really two sides of the same coin.
If I may applaud that. I mean, I think, we often speak of a society in which, for purposes of election politics, corporations are viewed as citizens, given certain kind of rights, and that we have to vote with our feet. I mean, we have to vote at the ballot box, but we also have to vote with our feet. And I think, I was pleased to hear that. I mean, that seems like a really critical theme, that you can't separate the two. And we learned that from our history, right?
Yeah, I like to think of voting as Febreze, right? Finish the room.
Well, to me, here too.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, for years, I think voting has been deemed as transactional. All right, I'm gonna go, I'm gonna vote, I'm gonna do my duty and move it on. Yeah. At this time, especially in the times that we're in right now in our society, we need to look at our vote as transformational. We need to look at our vote as not only just what we're doing with that vote that day, but how is that going to transform the feelings that we have individually and collectively to continue to put positive things in place, not just for this voting period, but for voting periods in the future. Our census is being threatened. Our educational system has been threatened for years, and has been gouged by a charter school program, charter schools that have opened up, 3 or 4 years, and then they close, make a profit, and then the public school system continuously suffers. The teachers continue to suffer, and until we take a hard stance on making whatever we do transformational instead of transactional. It's just like Christmas. Just because you give somebody a Christmas gift on Christmas Day doesn't mean that they're out of poverty. It just means you gave them a gift. Now give them a tool, give them a skill set, give them an opportunity to get a loan, give them an opportunity to get a job, a higher than minimum wage paying job. All those things are transformational in order to help us. I'm the first high school graduate of my family, the first college graduate of my family. That didn't happen because of constant transactions. That happened because of people that put transformative measures in place to ensure that people like me and others that were in a similar situation were able to change their mindset, change their practices, and then ultimately change their end results.
If I can just add, whoops.
Quickly, please.
Quickly, I just wanted to say I completely agree with Franita and with you, David, about voting and protest as being two sides of the same coin. But I think also the notion that Thaddeus was talking about accountability is very important. We have to think about how we devise and can construct mechanisms through which accountability can be more continuous, so that accountability isn't just a matter of showing up at the polls every X number of years, so that there are other ways that will involve citizens and hold office holders accountable. That's it.
You know, this is painful because this is such a great conversation. And I think, I want to be mindful of the time. I want to turn it back over to Professor Levitsky, but first I want to make a comment, and I'm so sorry that Midge isn't here. I want to put in a plug. The Charles Hamilton Houston Institute and the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center at Howard University are going to screen a film next Wednesday, October 28th, called John Lewis, Get in the Way. I was really pleased to hear Midge mention Congressman Lewis. I think, when we think about the relationship between being on the street and voting, there's nobody like John, nobody else, no other exemplar greater than John Lewis. And I think as we talk about and think about how to get young people out, I think we need to make sure that they see this film and that they know and recognize the role of John Lewis as a very young man, and that he didn't stop, right? It wasn't transactional, that is. It wasn't, it was a career, it was a life, it was a calling. So I've put in the chat a little our Twitter announcement of that. Please follow it and join us next Wednesday for that screening. It's a powerful film. With that, I turn it back to you, Professor Levitsky.
Thanks, David. I just want to say what a privilege it's been to listen to all of you, and also just to express my admiration for what you guys are doing. I grew up in the 1980s, an era in which athletes, for the most part, there were exceptions, but a lot of athletes kind of kept their head down, and the idea was you wouldn't get too political because you wanted to be able to market yourself to everybody. And I'm just really thrilled to see a new generation of athletes who are becoming leaders and speaking out. And you guys have made it very clear, very eloquently today, why that is so important. I think we have a chance to become a much better democracy, and relatively soon. I studied Latin America, which is a place where folks have been struggling for democracy for a long time. And the United States presented itself, historically, has always presented itself as sort of a model democracy in Latin America, or to Latin Americans. And that was always pretty hypocritical, because we were presenting ourselves as a model democracy at the same time that we had Jim Crow. Now today in Latin America, or in the world, we're not even presenting ourselves as a hypocritical democracy. We're just an international embarrassment. But I think we have an opportunity to really and truly become a model. Multiracial democracy is really hard. It's a really freaking hard thing to achieve. Very few societies on earth have pulled it off. But I think we're pretty close. What we did, what Americans did on the streets this summer, really shone, and it's shown all over the world. People were watching. People in diverse societies all over the world are watching, particularly a younger generation of Americans, build something very different from that which is governing us today. I think we can build a democracy that we're proud of. I think we can build a democracy that other people really admire. The majority is there. We just need to vote it into power. And I just want to reiterate Anquan's great point, just to restate his quote, or just to quote him. If your vote didn't matter, if your vote wasn't powerful, they wouldn't be trying to keep you from voting. So more power to all of you, and my applause.